a windswept rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, a sick man lay dying in a damp little room. May 1821. 2,000 kilometers from the nearest coast, with no army, no crown, and no way home. Outside his window, British sentries watched the door of the most famous prisoner on earth. Just 6 years before, this same man had ruled almost the whole of Europe. Now he could not even walk in his own garden without a guard counting his steps. This is the story of the losing side. He had been born on a small island, the son of a miner family no one expected to remember. Yet within 20 years he had made himself master of France and the terror of every king in Europe. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and for a time the continent seemed to belong to him alone. He crowned himself emperor and placed his brothers on the thrones of conquered nations. His armies marched from Madrid to Moscow, and crowns trembled wherever his cannon appeared. Millions obeyed him. Maps were redrawn at his word, and old empires bowed before his guns. He believed perhaps that no force on earth could ever truly bring him down. But the man who had risen higher than any king would also fall further than any of them, and his long fall would end on a speck of rock few people had ever heard of. It began in the frozen ruin of his greatest gamble, the invasion of Russia in 1812. He led 500,000 men into the east and brought only a broken remnant back through the snow. The kings he handled smelled blood, and all of Europe rose against him at last. In 1814, his enemies marched into Paris, and his own marshals forced him to give up the throne. They did not kill him. Instead, they sent him to rule a tiny island off the coast of Italy. It was called Elba, and there the conqueror of Europe was made the emperor of a garden. For a man who had commanded armies of nations, it was a cage dressed up as a kingdom. But Napoleon was not finished, and the powers of Europe had made a careless mistake. They had left the most dangerous man alive within sight of the coast of France. In the spring of 1815, he slipped away from Elba and landed in France with a handful of men. Soldiers sent to arrest him threw down their muskets and cried out his name instead. Within weeks, without a single shot, he was once more the Emperor of France. The kings of Europe declared him an outlaw and gathered their armies for one final reckoning. Everything came down to a single day, on a muddy field in Belgium called Waterloo. There, against the British and the Prussians, his last great army was broken for good. By nightfall the dream was over, and the man who had shaken the world was a fugitive again. This time his enemies were determined that he would never, ever escape a second time. He gave himself up to the British, hoping for mercy, perhaps a quiet life in England. But Britain had no intention of letting the great disturber of the world walk free. They chose for him the loneliest prison they could find anywhere on the globe. Far out in the South Atlantic lay a single volcanic island, ringed by cliffs and endless sea. It was called St. Helena, and it was one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. No coast lay within 1,000 miles. No friend, no army, no France could ever reach him there. The man who had owned half a continent was given one damp house on a rock in the ocean. When they told him his destination, even Napoleon fell silent at the cruelty of it. If you enjoy these stories of historical downfalls, take 1 second to subscribe to the channel. Now, back to the last years of Napoleon. In the autumn of 1815, they shipped him south, week after week, across the empty ocean. He stood at the rail and watched Europe sink forever behind the horizon. After more than 2 months at sea, the grey cliffs of St. Helena rose out of the waves. The island was a fortress of stone lashed by wind, soaked in mist and crawling with rats. They led him to a place called Longwood, a low and rotting house on a bleak plateau. The walls ran with damp, the wind never stopped, and the rooms stank of mould and decay. Here, in this miserable house, the Emperor of Europe was to spend the rest of his life. To guard him, London sent a cold and fearful man named Hudson Lowe. Lowe was not a soldier of glory, but a jailer, terrified that his prisoner might somehow escape. He surrounded Longwood with hundreds of troops, with cannon, signal flags, and patrol boats. Napoleon could not ride beyond a narrow boundary without a British officer at his shoulder. At night, the sentries were drawn in close around the house until he felt the walls themselves shrink. Lowe cut his household's money, opened his letters, and quarreled with him over the smallest things. He even refused to call his prisoner emperor, addressing him only as General Bonaparte. To the fallen Napoleon, that single denied word was a wound repeated every single day. The two men came to hate each other, and after a time Napoleon refused to see him at all. So the conqueror of Europe shut himself away, a prisoner, a man he would not even speak to. The days on St. Helena were long, grey, and almost unbearably empty. There were no battles to plan, no empire to rule, no crowds to roar his name. He filled the silence by dictating his memoirs to the few followers who had come with him. Hour after hour, he relived his victories, retelling Austerlitz and Marengo to men who wrote it down. In his words, he was still the emperor. Outside the window, there was only rock and sea. He walked his little garden, dug at the earth, and stared at ships that never came for him. His old companions slowly left or were sent away, until almost no one remained. The most famous man in the world was vanishing, forgotten on a wet rock at the edge of nowhere. And as the loneliness deepened, his body too began quietly to fail. A pain had taken root in his stomach, growing sharper with every passing month. He grew thin and weak, the restless conqueror reduced to a sick man wrapped in blankets. The same illness that had killed his father was eating its way through him now. He could no longer ride, then no longer walk, and at last could barely leave his bed. Through the long, damp nights, he lay in pain. In a country that was not his, under a foreign flag. He began to dictate his last wishes, his thoughts turning again and again to France. He asked that his body be carried home, to rest among the people he had once led. But even that final wish his jailers would refuse him for years to come. By the spring of 1821, everyone around him knew that the end was very close. On the 5th of May, a great storm tore across the island and uprooted the trees he had planted. As the wind screamed over Longwood, the emperor lay senseless on his narrow bed. In his last hours he murmured broken words, and among them, they say, was the name of his army. In the evening, as the storm raged on, Napoleon Bonaparte breathed his last. The man who had crowned himself master of Europe died a prisoner on a rock in the sea. He was 51 years old, and he had outlived his empire by only 6 short years. They buried him in a quiet valley on the island, under a stone that did not even bear his name. For his jailers and his enemies would not allow the word emperor on his grave. So the conqueror of a continent was laid to rest as simply nobody at all. He had commanded millions and redrawn the map of the world with his own hand. And he ended his days counting his steps in a garden, watched by a frightened guard. Years later, France brought him home in triumph and laid him in gold beneath a great dome in Paris. But the man himself had already learned, on that lonely rock, the true price of his ambition. He had reached for the whole world, and in the end was left with one damp room and the sea. This has been the story of the losing side.